So welcome back. As you can tell, I'm wearing a hat today because I ended up cutting my own hair, and while it may not turn out to be too bad, I figure it's better than trying to show it off. But anyway, as I said earlier this week, I filmed a video about the sacrament of marriage, and that I would follow it up with a video on annulments and what are annulments, because there's a lot of confusion within the church and by society as to what Catholics view towards annulments are and what we believe about them and how one gets them. So let's begin by looking at what an annulment is. Basically, it's a declaration that the church has come up with to declare that what appeared to be a sacramental marriage was not from the beginning. So even though they went through the wedding ceremony, they went through the marriage prep, they go on the engaged encounter, take the focus test, something happened that prevented the sacramental bond from forming. And it doesn't matter how long one is married. If something happens that prevents the sacramental bond from forming, then there's no sacramental marriage. And if there's no sacramental bond, that means one is in a natural marriage that can be annulled. But the main thing is that it's not the idea of Catholic divorce, that if a marriage fails, then we can just get an annulment. It doesn't work that way. And this is one of the reasons why we make couples go through the whole marriage process. Again, as I said before, a priest will go through 6 to 8 years of prep, formation, classes, and development just to prepare to enter into the vocation of the priesthood. But a married couple will go through a few sessions. So we try to do the best that we can when a couple's coming to get married to make sure that they know what they're entering into and that they're taking it seriously, because this does have lifelong consequences. It's just because you think you're in love, we want to make sure you're entering into marriage with full knowledge of what it is that you're planning on entering into, and that it's for life, and that this is truly the person you want to be with. But sometimes marriages fail. And when they fail, the party, depending on the reason why the marriage failed, they could apply for an annulment. So after the investigation, and it depends, every case is different. I had one case that I've done since I've been here that took maybe 3 months because the case was kind of obvious. But sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes it takes maybe a year. It just depends if both parties are open to applying for the annulment and going through the process, or if one is willing and the other isn't. But after the investigation, after the tribunal will look at all the evidence, they'll declare whether either there is a sacramental bond or no sacramental bond. And if there is a sacramental bond, one is not free to enter into a new marriage if the spouse dies. But if there is no bond, then one is free to enter into another marriage. And usually there'll be conditions that are placed on another relationship. Again, depends on the reason why the marriage failed, and maybe what was the cause for the annulment being granted. So again, it depends. And the thing that needs to be said is, again, the priest goes to the seminary for between 6 and 8 years. Some priests will go on to become canon lawyers. In other words, they study the canon law, the law of the church, and got the cat coming into view. So a canon law degree could take a few more years on top of that. So I only took a semester of marriage law, so I'm not perfect at it, but I have prepared couples over the years for an annulment and helped them with the process before handing it on to the chancery, who will then take over the whole procedure. So again, if an annulment is not granted, it means that there is a valid sacramental marriage between the husband and the wife, which renders each from being incapable of entering into a new marriage. And again, this is as long as the spouse is still alive, because one enters into marriage until death. And if there's a sacramental bond, you're not capable of entering into a new marriage until your spouse dies. Now, that doesn't mean you can kill her, because as my last video said, murder is an impediment that can prevent another marriage from occurring. But this can be appealed. So if the annulment is not granted, you can appeal to a higher court to have them look into it, and ultimately you could have it appealed to the Vatican. Myself, I've never had a case that went that far. So we got to look at the conditions that could prevent a marriage from becoming, that could render a marriage, that could prevent a sacramental bond from being formed. Yeah, get the cat. You might be able to hear my little kitty. So, what can render a marriage null? Well, prenups. The idea of a prenup is that it goes against the permanence of marriage. Hey, can I say hi to the people? So, again, you're planning on entering a lifelong union between you and your spouse that's only broken by death, but a prenup would be if the marriage fails. So you're putting a possibility that there might be a chance that the marriage won't last for life. Mental illness. And again, this is a very complicated thing. Mental illness can affect one's free consent, one's free will from entering into a marriage. Alcoholism is another example. If freedom of will is affected, you can't enter into something if you're not fully in control of yourself. But looking at also maybe something against the goods of marriage. Maybe one is not able to be faithful to their spouse. Again, it has to be shown before the marriage rather than afterwards. Maybe they're against having children, or maybe the idea of a marriage until death. But again, we'll go into each one of these a little bit more in depth. So consider the factors that might exist before the marriage. Maybe the husband sleeps around with a lot of people. Maybe the bride-to-be drinks too much. Maybe the spouse has a gambling problem. Maybe she never ever wants to have kids. Maybe they sign a prenup. So all of these conditions could be problematic. Prenup is always problematic. Let me rephrase that. Sometimes, very rarely, sometimes a prenup could happen. Example would be like older couple has kids, maybe something could be signed so that the inheritance would go to the kids to protect the kids' inheritance. So something like that. I think, again, it's been a while since I studied the law, but I think in something like that. And honestly, if that was a case that would come up, I would check with the chancery before I would even commit to it. So I'm not going to go ahead and tell a couple that's like in their 70s or 80s, maybe one of them is married to the Cabela sports chain family. Again, it just depends. So, and the main thing is it has to exist before the marriage. So if after the marriage, the husband starts sleeping around with everybody, having multiple affairs, well, it's not meant to sound cold, but the inability to form a sacramental bond, the reasons for being unable to form a sacramental bond has to exist before the marriage rather than develop afterwards. And again, this is why the church goes into the whole process. This is one of the reasons why the church looks into everything. It interviews many, many witnesses. So, but another example, and again, there's so many things that could render a marriage to be annulled. A Catholic is required by the law of the church to follow the Catholic form of marriage, which is being married in the church, in the presence of the church's minister, who asks and receives the consent in front of two witnesses. So if a Catholic gets married outside of the church, well, that would be invalid form. In other words, the sacrament would not occur because it's not done within the church. Sometimes a dispensation can be granted. So if a groom was marrying the minister's daughter, the groom's Catholic, she's Protestant, and wants the dad to do the marriage, a dispensation could be granted for that. But if you go ahead and do it without the dispensation, then that could be a problem. So the church looks into many, many things. People a lot smarter than myself who are trained in this, who have studied for years to be able to investigate these cases, but they'll look into the grounds for an annulment, whether there was a lack of knowledge on behalf of one or both of the spouses. Maybe one lacked free will, or maybe they had the inability to enter into a marriage. So again, just examples of this. So like defect of knowledge, something that they should have known but they didn't know. So this would be like ignorance. You can't be held accountable for something you didn't know if you didn't know it was wrong. Error or fraud or deceit. And we again have many examples of this. Ignorance. Gee, I didn't know that marriage was for life. Well, if they went through the Catholic marriage prep, this is something I know I usually stress in my marriage prep. This is for life. If it doesn't work out, it's not like you get to do it over again. There's no retries. Sometimes there might be an error in knowledge that they didn't know. Again, these are kind of rare examples, but they do happen. I usually consider this to be like the Maury Povich example. It turns out I'm married to my long-lost identical twin. It's happened. Fraud. Somebody that says that they've never been married before. They lied to the person so that they will marry them. Again, within the church, if one is Catholic, they are required to produce an updated baptismal certificate because it states all the sacraments that they have received. And if they were married inside the church, and if they were married before, then it should be on their sacramental record, which hopefully the priest will catch before a new marriage is entered into. And the other thing, too, is if it's annulled, it's also put into the sacramental record, saying that they were married on this date, but the marriage was declared null by the tribunal of whatever diocese they're in. So, defect of will. The idea that they're pretending, maybe they're giving conditional consent, or maybe they're being forced to do it. And we'll look at each one of these. So, the example that I always used was the movie Green Card. Now, this is an 80s movie, so not many people today probably know of it. But two people that met, one's not a citizen, the other is. They get married so that he can become a citizen, and they ended up falling in love afterwards. Well, if you're marrying the person to be able to become a citizen, that's not good enough to enter into a sacramental marriage. Getting married with the idea that you never will ever have kids, well, that goes against one of the goods of marriage, which is children, openness to children. Conditional consent. So this would get into the areas of prenups, that if the marriage doesn't work out, you get this, I get that. Or that I will marry you if only you will never do this, or I will marry you if only you will change that. Again, you can't put conditions on entering into a marriage. You have to freely enter into the marriage of your own free will. Force or fear. So the old idea of the shotgun wedding. You got my daughter pregnant, you're going to marry her. You're going to make an honest woman of her. Well, that's not a good enough reason to enter into a marriage. If a couple is entering into marriage because they got pregnant and that's the reason they're going to get married, we are going to investigate that to make sure that that's not the reason why they're getting married. That they're getting married because they want to spend the rest of their lives together. So, idea of defect of will would be that you're incapable of giving your full assent. So one of the things we usually stress is at the wedding rehearsal that there's to be absolutely no drinking on the day of the wedding until the reception, because if you're drunk, you lose your free will. You can't freely enter into a marriage if you don't know what's happening. So usually the threat we will make, and thankfully I've never had to carry it out, is if we see alcohol, if we smell it, marriage is off. And we're serious about this. Defect of capacity. So maybe they ate a lot of lead chips when they were a kid. Maybe they grew up near the power lines. Maybe they were dropped on their head one too many times. If they don't have reason, if they can't tell the difference between right and wrong, you can't enter into a sacramental marriage because you don't have the ability to know what's really happening. And the same thing with lack of discretion or incapable of entering into marriage because of psychic reasons. So maybe one is suffering from multiple personality disorder. The one time that they are a 7-year-old girl, and another time they're like a college professor. Again, it's not saying if you have a mental illness, you can't enter into marriage. If there is something that's there beforehand, the church will hopefully try to look into it, make sure that the couple knows what they're entering into. If there is an obvious mental illness, perhaps maybe a visit to the psychiatrist or psychologist to make sure that they know what they're entering into. So, but again, this would go back to the idea of lack of reason. Like I said, if you don't know the difference between right and wrong, well, can't enter into a marriage then. Lack of discretion, again, would be the idea that I'll change him. He'll change once he gets married. He'll stop drinking once he gets married. Usually that shows that there's something wrong, that there's a condition present that is serious enough that maybe it should stop the marriage process. Maybe it's, as the fourth point down there says, maybe it's a marriage on rebound from a broken relationship, that a couple had been going together for many years and they broke up, and then he meets another person and falls head over heels and marries her. Again, hopefully we know what we're entering into. Maybe one is too young to enter into marriage. As I said in the last video, one of the conditions that would need to be dispensed is age. And if I remember correctly, I believe a man has to be at least 16 and a woman has to be at least 14. And this is applying to the church universals. So, but let's be honest, not too many 16-year-olds are really capable of entering into a lifelong union. So, the idea of immaturity. Defective capacity. So, again, this would be, immaturity, severe immaturity. Maybe they continue to live the life as they did before they were married. That also gets into personality disorders, and as I just said, mental illness could play a role. It depends. But the main thing is, annulments are not the Catholic equivalent of divorce. So just because one applies for annulment does not mean it's going to be granted. I have not had much experience over the last 12 years. I've done a few cases. I prepared them. I think almost all the cases I've prepared, I've argued for the annulment to be granted for a variety of reasons. But, until I became a pastor, most of the cases were done when I was an assistant, and I wasn't in the parish long enough to be able to see the whole process go through, because as an assistant you're usually there for 2 years before you get moved, and again, depending on the case and sometimes the amount of cases that the diocese is handling, it can take a while. So as I was saying, if an annulment is granted, then that means that there's no sacramental bond, and if there's no sacramental bond, then one is free to enter into a new marriage. But if an annulment is not granted, then it means that there is a bond that is formed. It means one's not capable to enter into a new marriage until the spouse dies. So, and as I just said, for some reason, duplicate slide. The way to look at it is, the two become one flesh. This is why man leaves his mother and father and is joined to his wife, and the two become one. So, use an elementary example. Think of the man as a blue ball. Think of the woman as a yellow ball. Blue plus yellow means green. So, the two become one flesh. And as Matthew's gospel says, what God has joined together, let nobody break. So, the idea is that if they enter into marriage, if they enter into a sacramental marriage, it is assumed, until proved otherwise, that a bond has been formed between the two, that the two have become one, that they are no longer just man and woman, a blue ball and a yellow ball, but they have formed, they've been fused together. So what about divorce? Well, again, divorce could be permitted, but then one is unable to enter into a marriage until the spouse dies. And again, it depends on the reasons. Like if the person becomes very abusive, then yes, definitely for the safety of the other, divorce, separation should occur. But in the annulment process, if it could be shown that the person was abusive before the marriage, then that could be grounds for the annulment. But only death can break the sacramental bond. The Pope can't break the sacramental bond. God himself can't break the sacramental bond. Because as Matthew says, what God has joined, let no one break. So the whole purpose for annulments is to look at what happened prior to the marriage that would prevent a sacramental bond from being formed. So, and again, this is one of the reasons we make the couples go through all the hoops and hurdles, as much as I hate saying it. But they look into all these conditions, all these circumstances that I just talked about. If it is shown that there is no sacramental marriage, then the two never became one. So if the annulment is granted, it's saying that they are still separate, that they're not two, that they are two, they're not one. So in other words, something prevented the two from becoming one, something prevented the blue and the yellow from becoming green. So an annulment is saying that blue and yellow still exist, but the green was never formed. If the annulment is not granted, it means that a sacramental bond has been established and that the two are one and cannot be separated. So if the annulment is not granted, it means that the two did become one flesh and they have to wait for the spouse to die before they can enter into another marriage. Now, a Catholic, as I just said earlier, who marries outside of the church is considered to be invalidly married unless permission is granted. This does not mean a Catholic can get married by Elvis in Vegas. If a Catholic does that, gets married by a justice of the peace, they're considered to be invalidly married. In other words, it would not be a sacramental marriage, and they would be in the state of sin until the marriage is blessed by the church. And because of that, too, they would be unable to receive communion. So this would be also, for a Catholic that enters into a second marriage that has not been, where the first marriage has not been annulled, they would be married outside of the church. So they would have committed a grave sin by being married again when they're not free to marry. And that would render them in the loss of the state of grace and unable to receive communion. So, having taught high school for many years, it's always kind of fun to look at all these different packages where people can get married. You could get married by Elvis at the Las Vegas sign for only $700. And some of these, now, again, I chose the name The Nerd Father. I love nerd culture. But the idea that you're going to get married by Gandalf or Jean-Luc Picard on the bridge of the Enterprise, no. I do like Star Wars, at least up until Disney took them over. So sometimes in special circumstances, a marriage can be dissolved. And the two examples here would be a patrine privilege. And this would be for a case where a baptized was married to a non-baptized. So, as you can see here, the examples would be between a Catholic and a Jewish person, between a Lutheran and a Muslim, maybe a Methodist and an atheist, maybe a Catholic and an atheist. One is baptized, the other is not. And in a case like that, a marriage there would be no sacramental bond, but it could be dissolved. And I believe that one has to go to Rome. A Pauline privilege would be later on, this would be where two non-baptized enter into marriage, and later on one becomes baptized and becomes a Christian. So at the time of the marriage, it would be two Jewish people, maybe a Jew and a Muslim, unlikely as that is. It has happened. Maybe two Muslims, two atheists, Buddhists, and whatever. There still would be no sacramental bond. But later on, one decides to accept Christ into their heart and is baptized. And if the marriage then failed, well, then the Christian could apply for the dissolution of the marriage. And I cannot for the life of me remember what part of St. Paul's letters that comes from. Again, I taught sacraments and church history, so I'm more prone to those two areas. Anyway, so the examples again would be maybe two Hindus marry, and 3 years later the wife becomes a Christian. Some people would find this so offensive that they would divorce. Again, it can be dissolved. Or for the last example would be two Muslims marry, and then 15 years later on the wife becomes Christian. So again, I think I've only done one of these in 12 years. That would be the Pauline privilege, where I think it was the Petrine, where one of them, again, at 12 years, it's hard to remember everything that one has done. But I think there was a case where one was baptized, the other was not. The marriage failed, and we applied for the privilege. But like I said, it's been so long. But anyway, that's an overview of what the church teaches about annulments. I hope that you found this video helpful. Please be sure to like the video, share it. It helps out, helps build my audience. But if you have any questions, leave a comment. I'll try to get back to you. So until next time, take care and God bless.